was the volume that I started getting nervous at.
That's good to know.
All right, we're going to take a look at book covers. Chapter number 10. We get ourselves back on task today. So we're going to understand the purpose of cover design, what exactly is going to go into them, become acquainted with the process of designing a cover, and then we're going to go and we're going to also start to realize what happens and what can we do from a design requirement standards when we get into actually working with a series of covers, and also at what point do we really need to start to think about things related to a series. So what is the purpose of a cover design?
To sell you.
To sell you?
Tell you what the book is about without like spoiling too much and stuff like that.
All right, we're a little farther along than where we need to be at. What's the first thing of a book cover?
Keep the book within pages.
Grab your attention. So we go into a bookstore. Why do you choose the book that you choose on the shelf? It could be you going in there and that's specifically what you're there for. I'm here to kill a mockingbird, the book. And with that, you're in there and you're going right towards that book. Other times you're going, I'm really here to find a book, so we're going to walk around and start looking. It needs to grab your attention. Why does it need to grab your attention? No, because
So you care about it.
so you know it
Buy
exists.
something you never see.
Right. You're never going to buy something that you never see. So it needs to go in there, and first off, it has to grab your attention. Now, once it grabs your attention, it then goes into begin to communicate what the actual theme is of the book. So we can't learn about something if we don't know it exists, so therefore first it grabs the attention, and then it begins to communicate what we have inside of the book. So as it states in here, the cover actually has a hybrid purpose. It's to attract and to communicate. As you go through and start to think about what it is that you're placing on there, what is it that you are ultimately trying to say with it? Just like anything else that we start to work with, you'll hear from me in every class you take with me, I'll start talking about the narrative. What is it that you're trying to say with that design? It goes through everything that you choose. So we go through and we start to look at it. We're typically going to see that book covers are going to have type and image. Remember, those are the two things that we have when it comes to designing. We're designing with type, we're designing with images. Things don't fall anywhere other than that. So as we go through, we start to look at that. We have type and image. So we go through and we start to think about what is it that we're going to work with, or how are we going to use these things? Well, as we go through and begin to choose the stuff, how do we want them to relate to each other? Remember, we start thinking about contrast. Start thinking about having things that are similar. So when we start with similarities, we can also get into repetition. So as we start to think about that, they may have similar characteristics. We go through and we start to choose the image and we choose the text. The other thing we start to talk about is the voice. Remember, we go all the way back to typography. We started talking about type has voice. The way that we see stuff, we go in there with the bold stuff, the heavy stuff, it's louder to us. Also, as we go through, we can start to type things out so that you say them in a certain way to allow us to reinforce what it is that we have for that voice. The other thing we do is we can actually go through and we can start to have them contrasting with one another. So as we go through and we start to choose the text, are we putting something in the text? Or we work with the image? Are we dealing with things that are very solid? We can have a pattern inside of them. We start thinking about type. Too often we get into typography as we start to work with stuff, is that we sit there and say all we can do is type out something. We're going to choose a typeface, Times New Roman, bold, 28 point, with we're going to enlarge the tracking by 10%. But it's not necessarily that way. We can also go and we can start to work with hand-rendered type. So you may start and lay it out in a way with regular type, but then we can go ahead and put tracing paper over top of it, and we can go in there, we can draw in some flags, some finials, some flourishes to it, some just adding in some spirals. But we can go in, we can work with that, we can scan that back in and bring it into programs like Illustrator and turn that into a vector image, and then that's going to become our text that we're going to use on the book covers. And then the other thing is we can go in there and we can start to look at how we're going to work with the context of the text and the image. So we're going for something a little bit more neutral. So as you go through, you start to think about what you're designing and why you're choosing the stuff that you're choosing. What is it that you're ultimately trying to show with it? So as you start to think about the image and the text that's in there? What is it you're trying to do with it? We go back and we start to think about different ways of visualizing. Same thing starts to come into play. Why are we choosing those images? Are we going for some sort of abstraction? Are we trying to go through and showcase something based upon our own individual reading? That all goes back to that narrative. So as we go through and you start working with it, what is it that you believe the story is, or what are they trying to say in there? Is there a moral to it that you want to go and focus on that part? Are you bringing out a certain piece of the play that you're looking at? So as you go through and start to think about how are you using all of those things. Now we get into working with it. There's 4 basic schemes that we have inside of here to go through and work with. There's all type, there's image driven, there's type driven, and then lastly there's image and type synergy. So we go through and start dealing with all type. In this case, that's all that's going to be on there. So when we talk about all type, there are not going to be any images. Do you have an author, do you have a book that just simply putting the text on there saying this book, this author, you go, oh, I know exactly what that is. Harry Potter. If you go in there and you work with that, and it's all type, and you use especially, I mean, you can even get away with Harry Potter by not even using the type that looks like the title. I mean, you can just put the text on there, Harry Potter, and people are going to immediately come to it. Once you go and you add the typography that matches up with the name, then there's going to be absolutely no doubt that everybody goes in and they see that. So as we start to think about that, can you do that? In the early phases, a lot of them can't actually handle that. It's just not going to work. As you go on and it becomes more recognizable and that branding gets pushed and pushed and pushed, then all of a sudden we do have the capability usually of going back and we can do something that's just all type. So think about elegant books. That's usually we're going to see something that's all type, no images. Type driven. In this case, we go through and we look at the title of the book. That's going to be the text that's going to be on there. And then we're going to go in and we're going to start to look at the author's name. Those 2 elements are the predominant images or predominant things that you're seeing on there. You'll hear me talk about images when we start dealing with typography, because remember that type, once we go through and we create type on there, we see type though ultimately as an image. We start looking at density and everything in the boxes and title blocks. So when we go through and start to look at it, what are we adding into it? How does the image come into play in it as well? But at this point, it's still driven by the typography. So we're expecting people to recognize again the name of the bless you.
Sorry.
We're looking at the name of the book as well as the author of the book, and that's going to draw in some focus, or at least grab your attention. But then we're going to work with the image itself that's going to assist in that. But again, it is predominantly done by the type. Our viewer is going to be attracted to it because they recognize the title and they recognize the author. The third one, image driven. In this case, the image becomes the predominant thing that we're looking at. So that's the element that's going to actually take and draw us into the book cover. So we start thinking about going into it, we talk about lifting. So image driven, the image is doing all the heavy lifting. Type driven, the type is doing all the heavy lifting. And then we get into image type synergy. In this case then, they are working together. So if you go through, if we were to put them on a scale, of course, if we look at it from the standpoint image driven, the image side is going to be all the way down. Type driven, all the way down. It's going to be balanced out when we start to work with type and image. Are we going? It's contagious. So as we go through and we start to work with it, you have to start to think about what direction do you think you need to take for your play. Because the same thing we have in the book covers are similar strategies that we have going on in the posters that you just worked on. So you should start to see how these things begin to repeat themselves. So as we start to think about it, what is it that we're doing? What is it that we need to have inside of there? So here's an example of all type. We have these rules that show on here. That's what the lines are. When we're talking about rules, we're not talking about what you should or shouldn't do. The rules are placed in there as we look at the type. So we go and we start to look at this. You know, you start to look at what are they doing with the type, how are they actually bringing your attention to it. So we have a kidney for sale by owner. Anybody want to buy?
I'm in the market.
You're in the market for one?
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, Mark might have one here. I'm not really sure, but you can check with him. So in this case, we're looking strictly at type. So some people may start to argue that they're playing with textures and stuff in the background. It's not a recognizable, identifiable image, so therefore this is going to be all type. That's just a little bit of texture that's on there to look like the paper itself. What's interesting about this poster?
It barely counts as a poster. It's something that's a post cover.
Or I mean, a book cover. This is actually, it is a book cover on this one. I was thinking poster. It looks like a poster to me. But on the book cover, see, that's the problem. We have posters, we have book covers, and they use the same process through them. But on the book cover, but when we go through and start to look at this, what are we thinking with this? There's something different about this as well. And it plays into the same when we start thinking about even from a poster design, it's a design idea. What's
If you would have showed me without any context, I would have thought it was a zoomed in article on newspaper.
okay? So zoomed in article on newspaper. What's the other thing when we talk about it from an orientation standpoint?
Literally text.
Vertical text?
Right. So it's not vertical text. Vertical text ends up going down where you stack one letter on top of another. This in here, we're actually changing the view, so we're rotating it around. So what we typically would see as a baseline actually runs up and down versus left and right. So it does force you to go in there. Now, a lot of things can happen with that. Legibility, potential issues. The other thing, though, that I like when you start playing around with moving the baseline is that you have to interact with it. So as you interact with the book cover, you're going to be turning it as well to read stuff. Here's one that is type-driven. When we start talking about type-driven, it means that the heavy lifting is being done by the type itself. There's still imagery that's also included, but it's just there playing that supporting role. So we can see here as we start to look at the text here, we have some clouds and everything in the background, in foreground, and it's actually there to support what's going on. So again, very much type-driven. So we go through, we start to think about things from image-driven. The illustration was drawn in Illustrator, then made into a 4-part stencil. So we start thinking about the process that's here. She's going through and talking about the process. The stencil pieces were spray painted on poster board and assembled in Photoshop for the final design. So what we have is we have somebody who's working with traditional as well as digital. And then this is what she actually came up with as we start looking at the illustration and book cover for City of Snakes. So remember, we go back, we start to look at this. This is where she's talking about drawing an Illustrator 4-part stencil. So she comes out here and makes the stencil pieces to it. And then ultimately this is what we end up getting into as we start to look at the different pieces. So as we start to think about the process, you start to work with the process. Don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. Think about what other ways you've learned in your foundations art classes. Do a little bit of additional research even to get a different look, a different feel. So when I talk about working and understanding materials, understanding processes, what are the characteristics of the processes? So when we go back and start talking about the printing process, lithography, intaglio, what's happening when we go through to work with screen printing. How can we take those same ideas and use them? We could always take them, we could print onto a piece of paper by traditional means, and then scan that in, and then use that inside of Photoshop or even Illustrator. We can go, like I said before, when we talked about hand-rendered type, scan that back in, do an image trace of it, and then be able to still manipulate that as a vector graphic inside of Illustrator. Because what's going to happen with that is there's certain things that will occur as we go through and we begin to work with those traditional forms that we're not going to be able to easily replicate or realistically replicate inside of the box sitting in front of you. So as we start to think, again, don't be afraid to expand out into them. So here when Jamie Keenan talks about going from an image standpoint, so this is the narrative, the idea behind the image-driven setup, which is going to look like this. So we jump back here. I wanted to come up with something that was simultaneously perfectly innocent and completely seedy. So pink's a good color for both of these. Once the image had come together, the job of the typography was really just to keep it out of the way. We go there, we start to look at it. Here's the goal. We're looking at this. The image is carrying it. We start to look at the focus on it. Where do we go to? What are we seeing with it? Where does the eye move through it? So you start to look at this book cover. Where exactly are you finding yourself looking at it? And those are things that, as you look at designs out in the real world, you drive down the road, billboards, if you're walking through a store, magazines, book covers, any place that you're at, start looking at those designs and understand how is it that you move through it. Start to identify things. And it's really up to you as you look at them. Sometimes we get the things that maybe you're going to say it's image driven. Somebody else may say that that's type image symmetry. Synergy. So as we go through, we start to look at that. What are we doing with it? In this case, we have a very simple type. It's designed as just a basic typeface that's been added on there just so you know what it is that you ultimately are looking at. In this case, Lolita. Now, as we start to think about each of those, now how can we go through and start to bring things in to get image and type symmetry? What you may find as you start dealing with image and type symmetry is that depending on who looks at it, you may determine and say, well, I think that's really more image driven, or that's really more type based. As you go through and you look at this, from an image type synergy. The synergy of this is what's happening there as we're using the text kind of to replicate what we'd have for teeth inside the mouth. When I look at this, I think a lot of this, at least for me, seems to be more image driven than an image type synergy. That's just my take on it. You may look at it and disagree, which is perfectly fine. But on this, what they're pushing for is that each of them carries the same weight, but I think as we start to look at it from an image standpoint, there's a lot more image-driven setup to that. Now we go and we start to look at this, we need to have a checklist to work with. And these are all the things we go through, we start to look at that you should essentially evaluate your cover design based upon. Number one, do you actually know the book's content? And do you know who their target audience is? That's key. Demographics is a key element anytime we design stuff. That's going to guide you on everything from color scheme to typography to imagery. It's all driven by who you are actually trying to go through and attract. To attract them, you have to create that visual interest. So how are you going to get their attention? You've chosen specific type in that based upon the demographics, so therefore, use that. Get their attention with it. Choose recognizable things for them. As you go through and you start to look at how are you working with the type in there. So you have the author's name, you have a title, book title, you have an image. Unless you're doing it all type, and then you won't have an image. But as we go through and we start to work with those, what is the visual hierarchy? If we go back to the image type synergy one, it's safe to say that your main focus probably becomes the image itself, and then you move into the type. At least that's how I view it. So what is that clear hierarchy? Make sure you go through and you really think about it. I want the people to see this first, this second, this third. So when they look at this, I want them to see the image, then I want them to see the title, then I want them to see the author. Or I want them to see the title, I want them to see the image, and then I want them to see the author. You should have it designed in a way to work so that we're seeing the things in the order that you have them set to be seen in. Make sure that any type that you put on there and any images that you use work together so they cooperatively come in and tell us this is what we're doing. Make sure that we're not choosing a typeface that's saying something different and actually contradicts what it is that you are attempting us to go through and see. Make sure that how you go about doing this, you're also expressing the essence of the book's content. Now this is a little bit more difficult because as we go through and start thinking about it, we're looking at what is it that you interpret based upon what it is that you read. And through that you build the narrative. So the key on here is that really what we're talking about there is that you actually express in your design the essence of what you believe the book content is about. What is it saying and why? Now as we go through, you've probably been in a bookstore. Anybody not been in a bookstore? Okay, everybody's been in a bookstore. So what's in a bookstore?
Books.
A lot of books. A lot of books. So as we go into a bookstore, how do they go about differentiating books?
By genre, for instance?
Genre. So we know that we are going to be choosing a book, or the book that we're working on is designed specifically for a specific genre. So that genre, when we walk into there, is there just one book in that area? No, there's a bunch of them. So what we have to be able to do is we need to make sure that we can differentiate what it is that we're making from the other titles that are going to be on the shelf. So what are you going to do to make it unique? If we go back to when store brands first started really hitting the shelves, and that's, what did they try to do with that? They tried to make them actually look a lot like the actual regular brand. So when you went and you dealt with Jell-O, when you went to buy a Kroger brand Jell-O, it was in a blue box a lot of times. Of course, it said Kroger on it, but it was set up because in this case, they wanted you to actually purchase it by accident. It's really what they wanted. At least that's my take on it. What you find now, though, is now they just go to cost cutting, so it's all about simple, using as few colors as possible, and there you go. That's just what you have. So in this case, we want to go through, we want to actually make sure that we make whatever it is that we're doing unique, differentiate from the other titles. So when you go in there, you know exactly what it is you're looking for. So when we get to working in a series or thinking about the series, how are we going to continue that? So if we're dealing with colors, we looked at the poster one. If we go back to the poster one, we're dealing with the colors and the silhouettes and what are you choosing. Same thing happens inside of a book series. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to work with it? What are you going to place in certain locations that's going to repeat? If you go through and you start to look at authors that you really enjoy reading, does anybody have an author that they really enjoy reading?
I mostly read comic books.
But with that, if you think about the ones you like to read, you're going to find that there's things that are placed in the same spot. How are they working with the title? Title's got similar stylistic approach to it. The location of the author's name is always there. So if you go there and a certain author, their name's always across the top and it's the largest, their goal is that you're going to buy that book just because you buy every book from that author. If you're looking at it from a title standpoint, it's going to be there. Maybe they put their name in a little smaller, it's at the bottom, but you know to look for their name in that location when you go to look for their book. So as we go through, start to think about that. Start to look at proportions. So we start talking about trim size. So we go through, they're going to cut the book down to a certain size. What are the proportions as we go through and we start to work with that? So we start to think about how much space are we taking up. We can deal with the rule of thirds. So these are look at our placement. We look at overall proportions. Are we staying within that golden proportion or not? We start to look at the spine. A lot of people forget about the spine. That's the area when we set it on the shelf. We see the edge of the book. What's that doing for you? What are you seeing on that? How are you still communicating with that? Sometimes it's all we have a chance to see. So what are you doing with the type? What are you doing with the images and everything as it gets into that spot? As we go through and design it, don't get caught up thinking that, I'm just designing the front cover of the book. No. That is the key part. We hope that our book actually is going to be sitting on the shelf just like this, so you can see the whole thing, but it's not always. Sometimes this is all we're going to see. Sometimes someone's going to flip it around backwards. And all we may see then is the back of their books. As you go through and you start to work on the designs, you start to think about the designs, make sure that you're thinking about it in its entirety. Front, spine, back.
So let me guess. Our homework assignment, we have to make the front, spine, and back of the book.
Your homework assignment is, I gotta look.
True, please.
The other thing to pay attention to when you design a book cover is the way it is laid out. What do you notice about this?
The gradient continues on the spine toward the back.
Just the organization. What's on the left?
Everything?
No, what's on the left?
Nothing.
Which part is that?
Back.
It's the back. You'll be amazed how many people go in to design a book cover. We go through and we have everything set. They come in here and they make this the front cover, this the spine, this the back cover, only to have us assemble it. What happens there? It's backwards.
That's like a manga.
I was gonna say, I'm pretty sure the only thing that's set up in that way is manga.
Yeah, so you have to watch
Normal book.
as you go through and you start to work with designing your book cover, is that you think about how it's going to get folded around the book, making sure that you have your front cover in the right location. I can't count on my two hands, probably not even my two hands and my feet, the number of book covers that have been turned in, final production pieces, and go, my front cover's on the back. Because you don't think that way. You're going in there and you end up designing it entirely different than what it should be, because you're thinking, okay, my front cover, my spine, my back cover. It's not the way they get set up.
Unless you're into it.
What's that?
Unless you make manga.
Sure. Or unless you, I don't know what else to do. So we go through and we start getting in here. So this is what is there from the process. So how did you go about working on there? So in this case, the cover image was shot on location in Long Island, Queens, and the metal letters were shot in the studio. So in this case, the inspiration was the famous silver cup sign in Long Island City, New York. And when we look at it here, here's what we go through and we start to have with it. Now, what else can we go through and do with this? How else can we work with the stuff? So we start looking at the individual letters that are there. So with this, she set them up and said she shot them in a studio. Are there ways we can go through and create the same text utilizing software? Yeah, we can. But again, remember, we go back to the standpoint. If we can create something by using traditional means, it's going to have a much more realistic appearance to it than if we go through and completely try to create something utilizing the computer. So start to think about those processes, play a little bit with the processes, and think about how else you can go in and get the stuff from there. You'll notice too, as you start to look at it, the idea as to where things ultimately ended up being placed. They may or may not remain in the exact location. There will be slight changes to things as you go through and begin to work with it. She had the ideal setup based on this image, went and shot a different image, of course, built the structure and everything onto there to allow her to see, or allow us to see what all is there. Start looking at positive, negative shape relationships. How can we go through and control from a visual standpoint? So we start to see here, again, choice was author's name at the top. It leads itself down. Those two leaves that are there face each other. Notice the fact that they decided to go ahead and put the points and everything, the jagged edges to the inside, which is going to help direct our eye back into it. And so those kind of work like arrows. So it leads us into there. So we kind of read this from a cascade effect. We start at the top with the name of the author, moving our way down into the middle and then to the bottom. At least that's how I come in here and look at it. You may find that you have the focus on the leaves. The other thing we start to have here is you play a little bit from a relationship as we look at it from, again, we're looking at positive, negative space. Some people have told me they look at this and it's as though they're seeing through the area where the leaves are at. So what is it you're trying to say with it as you go in and begin to work with it? Now let's talk about symmetrical structures. And if we go back to this one, very, very symmetrical. So what's going to happen as we go through and we start to look at it? How can we go in and begin to lay these things out and composing it? Obviously, we go through and we start to compose stuff, and we compose those things, and we work symmetrically. It's a lot easier, right? We have something on the left, there's got to be something in the same location on the right. If we go in and we place all center aligned text, we slice it right down the middle, we're going to have half the text on the left, half the text on the right. So as you go through and you start designing, most people, because it is the easier way to start, it's easier on placement, is to go and design from a symmetrical standpoint. Now we also get in here to approximate symmetry, and that's the sense that we're looking at slicing this, but is it exactly? No. I mean, we go through, if we start boxing this content, you're going to start to see that there are little pieces that are on one side but not on the other. But the majority of what we have on here is close, therefore we have approximate symmetry. So as we go in and work, you as a designer get to figure out whether we're going to have a main focal point or if we're going to have multiple focal points. And what is it you need to have in there? So when we go through, we start to look at the visual hierarchy. You're going to have a main one. That's the first one you see. If we go through, we take your book cover, we lay it out, and we set a piece of tracing paper over it, and each person walks up and says, all right, I want you to draw, a 1 over the thing that you see first. Everybody should actually go in there and mark the exact same thing. When you do that, then we know that we've gone in, we have the emphasis on the key focal point that is there. And then as we also go through and look at it, what are the other points that go in there? So where do we go second, third, fourth, fifth? As we go through there, we start talking about the flow through what it is that we're seeing. So we go through and start to work with those. Those things are dependent upon each other. Our goal here is to achieve the flow and the rhythm through the placement of things. As we start to work with that, there's a lot of ways we can choose to guide the viewer through this. So what are we using as cues to indicate where we should be going, what we should be seeing next? We can do that through size. So if it's large, it's the biggest and the boldest, we're going to see it. We can also start to do that not only through the size, but also what are we dealing with color relationships. Or as we go through, we start to see things, and we're looking at them with the color. We see a bunch of red things on the page, even if they're not by each other, we tend to group those things. So the same thing happens when we go through and read things, see things. As we go through and see them, we have them, we recognize them. Shapes, we're going to see those shapes. Colors, we're going to see those colors. So as we go through and start to use those, start to think about what is it that you're doing with them, how are you working with them. As opposed to just using one large, singular, iconic image, think about how we can use different images on there, which will allow us to kind of float through the design. So allow those to go in there and support. So we start talking about the key things, and there's those supporting roles. So what is it that we have for those supporting roles? How are those going to continue to play? We can also get into corresponding movements. So as we go there, we start to choose things. So in this case, as we go about aligning stuff, make sure that it correlates with something else that's in there. We start to look at the typography in here. So we have the plane flying. We get the line formed by the bottom of the plane. So we go ahead and they use this by creating then these lines from the photograph, so it's just sitting on the page, and using those then to help define areas. Instead of having the text then go against the angle of the plane in the photograph, they choose to go ahead and repeat that line over and over again on the placement of the text. So what's going to happen is we automatically then get harmony between these, because one just repeats what the other does, and repeats and repeats and repeats as we continue through it. So we talk about main focal points versus multiple. What we have here is we have a star. The star on the left is a single star. The star on the right, as we break it down, also would go back together to be the same as the other star. So what else can you do with that? Essentially going in there, they start thinking about fractured reality to it. So how can we go in and break that? Fracture what's there, move those pieces around. Think of a slide puzzle, same type of concept. So do we want to go in and do we want to have parallel movements like we have on the right? Or we want to go in, start to work with the lines then for the arc. What's going to happen with that? What's going to happen from a movement standpoint? Now as you go through and start to work with things, as we read stuff, as we look at stuff, there's a rhythm to it. It's kind of like music. We go through and we start looking at music. Well, how do we come up with music? Well, it's not the notes themselves, it's the space between those notes until we get to the next one. So when we look at the pattern, what is it? How are we placing things? How are we repeating things? So we start looking at color. What's going to happen as we go through and start to work with the color? How do we bounce through it? What happens when we have our color changes? The other thing we can start to push is instead of having obvious focal points, what are other areas we can end up placing things? How can we start to work with them? What's there? How are we going to flow through it? We look here from the picture window. So with this, in this story, it's about young love as well as a love letter to a classic American city. The title, you see the title here, Map of Tulsa, and the author's name they use in black type. And they appear to actually be in front of what's going on. And then what's happening through is we're looking out at, so we can see the face on here. In this case, we go through and we start to look at how we're seeing this, how we're working with this, what's going to happen with it. Talk about looking through a window. It's like we're looking out. If you kind of think about it from the standpoint that the black text is actually like a vinyl graphic on a window, and we're seeing her behind there. There are additional things. We start to deal with the sky in there. So we look at the stars themselves, most likely pulled from an idea of a night sky and the fact that we can see the stars. But what do we start to see as we start to work with this and start to think about what is there? The other thing we can go through and start to look at, are we seeing things simultaneously or almost simultaneously? So in this case, we've gone through and we've placed the text directly over top of the image. Now by having the text over the image, it gets to the point to where you're sitting there and kind of competing with what are you seeing first. Some people may look at that and immediately be drawn to the image. Some people may look at it and be drawn immediately to the text. The fact that they both occupy the same space allows us again to simultaneously see them, and each of these items complements the other one. Balancing shapes and visual hierarchy. So when we go through, we start to think about visual hierarchy. In this case, they have us going from top down. So we have the face on there. Now, some of you may not recognize what that is, but the face is actually made out of part of that tape. So that video cassette tape that's there goes through and is drawn out, pulled out, with the idea of it makes up the shape. And then what we have below there, as you'll see on it, says video cassette. So this is the video cassette label. And what's one of our challenges potentially by doing something like this? I've already highlighted it. How many people know what a video cassette is?
Quite a few people do, but there are also people that don't. Like the younger people don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Oh, this book may be part of it for like older audience.
Right, so as you choose things, the key on there is to make sure that your audience is going to recognize what it is. If somebody has no clue what a video cassette is, the whole purpose of this begins to lose its appeal. Flow, so we go through and work at it. Remember, you're there, you're the designer. You're also the composer. And what you're using to compose your music or your orchestra is everything that you decide to put on the page. So how are people going to read it? What's going to be the movement through it? How are we controlling how you're viewing that? How do you get a smooth transition from one point to the next? So how are we moving from an object inside of there? Even if it's a regular photograph, you take this photograph, you put it on there. How are we looking at that photograph? Multiple objects inside of that photograph. What are we seeing first, second, and third? So we can play with that. Start to think about perspective, atmospheric perspective, so we can add a little bit of a haze. Are you going to blur an area? Why are you blurring that area? Well, because everybody sees that first. I don't want them to see that. I want them to focus on this. And they can move through the blur. It's only blurred enough to, again, de-emphasize it just a little bit. So when you go through and do this, what's happening with this? What's the pace that we go through it? Are we hung up on things? Do we bounce through it? Or we move very quickly through that? So as you go through and you begin to put them together and begin to work with them, at what point do we have to begin to think about designing for a series? Any guesses? At least from my recommendation, when do we have to start to think about designing for series?
Like,
When there starts being more than like one book or movie.
Okay.
Like you get like a broad every time you do the first one, you're like, hey, I can make all the others a little bit similar to this, so they know it's insert thing here, like Harry Potter for instance.
Okay.
Everyone knows what Harry Potter is.
So Wednesday of next week, we need to start thinking about it? We start thinking about it. I recommend that when you start designing anything that's, book cover wise from an author, that in the back of your mind, you're already thinking, what happens if this becomes part of another series? What happens if this author writes another book? How many authors only write one book? Well, there's a lot of them out there, but if you're specifically designing a book cover for somebody, odds are they'll write multiple books. So I suggest that early on, you begin to think about designing for a series. So as you start to put that together, and just again, back in your mind, okay, how can I work with the titles? How can I work with the author? What type of imagery am I going for? What would the next one look like? And the one after that. Okay, I can see in my head now, I can see 3 of them together. So when we start to think about that, there's a lot of different ways we can work with them. There should be similarities between them. We're not talking about going in there and making them exactly the same. But often what's going to happen is you're going to take whatever that design is and you're going to put that into a template, and with that template, it's going to allow you to go in then and begin to play with it. What it's there for is just there for the basic structure of it. Like we go through, we start thinking about house plans. You can drive down the street like, wow, that looks like the house 2 doors down, except for the garage and 2 doors down is on the left, and down here it's on the right. So again, they're not the exact same plans. They're flipped, they're mirrored, but they do actually share then things. So when we talk about design standpoints, the same stuff is going to go into there. Each cover in here could be a fraternal twin. So in this case, there's enough variation within them to distinguish one from another. But there's also enough things that are similar to them that we are going to know that they're actually within that series. And then if you want to go down to a little bit more variation, you can go ahead and start to look like cousins. So therefore, there's a little bit of resemblance, but not so much to where you're right away like, yes, that's definitely there. And you can get a little bit of this sometimes when we get into genres. People will actually design stuff to where it matches up with certain things, or maybe if you play off of another story, you're going to play with the idea that there are similarities within there. So when we go in and we start working with, or you start designing a book series, right away start to think about what is it you're going to do with it. Don't be afraid to go in and experiment. I do strongly urge you to do a little bit of research and start looking at processes. If you haven't gone in and started to look at the various printing processes, do so. If you haven't gone in and looked at history related to different areas, different formats in which we're going to be designing for, I encourage you to go in and do that. Because all we're doing from a digital standpoint is we're replicating a lot of the stuff that's been done in a traditional form. Nothing is going to go through and supplement your learning, your designing, more so than looking at what other people have done, what other people have gone in and worked with.